The scripture reading this morning, as you can see, is taken from Ruth, the book of Ruth, chapter 3, verses 1 through 13. Ruth, chapter 3, 1 through 13. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it might be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with those whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he'll tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say, I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, his heart was merry. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and then she came and softly uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled, turned over, and beheld a woman lay at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I'm Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this the last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow kinsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it's true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. But if he's not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you and lie down until the morning."
Before we dive into our study today, I do want to make you aware that in just under 2 weeks, we're going to be hosting Refine Weekend. Now, you may recall the terminology of Refine as an event that occurred in December every year for the past few years, when we would present our theme for the upcoming year. We've made some changes to when some of these events occur, and some changes to what they entail. For now on, Refine is going to be like an in-house seminar, an in-house lectureship kind of event. It will be taking place towards the end of the month, here in February, on February 22nd and 23rd. That's a Saturday and a Sunday. We're going to have 4 sessions on Saturday, and then, of course, on Sunday, we'll have our morning Bible class, morning worship, and 1 o'clock afternoon worship with a potluck in between. The reason we're having 4 sessions on Saturday is because we're partnering with our efforts involving the Georgia School of Preaching and offering this weekend as an opportunity for a short course for Georgia School of Preaching. Now, that doesn't mean those are the only people that can come to this. We want everyone who's available to be here to join us for this in-depth study on prayer that Brother Dan Winkler will be presenting to us. He's been here many times before, and he's a beloved preacher, and so it will be a great study if you'll make time to come out. Now, we understand spending 4 to 5 hours here on Saturday, followed by the same amount on Sunday, may not be something you can do. But if you can come out for a couple of sessions on Saturday, come out for the morning sessions, come out for the afternoon sessions or the after lunch sessions, we'd love for you to be here and to be a part of it. If you plan to attend, you can register online. Particularly if you plan to eat with us, we need to get a count on how many want to enjoy that meal on Saturday as well. So please go online and register. Please consider coming to this. Make time to come study prayer with us if it will fit into your schedule. We'd love for you to be a part of it. But be aware that on Saturday, February 22nd and Sunday, February 23rd, we'll be hosting Refine Weekend. Next Sunday, we're going to have a guest speaker as well. I will be out of town, and so Chase Burnett is going to be presenting the lesson that morning. So make sure to come and hear Chase preach to us. He is quite nervous about it, but he's going to do fantastic because Chase is an excellent teacher. Also, next Sunday night, we're going to have a singing night. So, Chad, that's your reminder, number one. Number two, come out Sunday night next week and join us in praising God in song. The last couple of times we've had a singing night, they have been wonderful. So please join us next Sunday night for that as well. A lot of announcements here on the front end, and I know that can get overwhelming. But be aware of the things we've got going on because the Beaufort Church of Christ is blessed. Amen. We are a blessed congregation, and there are phenomenal opportunities for you to spiritually grow and to fellowship with your brothers and sisters in Christ, and we want you to be aware of all those that are coming your way. As a reminder, our congregational theme this year is fruitful. So we've been examining the first fruit of the Spirit for the past 5 weeks. We've been examining love, and we've been doing so through the context or through the lens of the book of Ruth. Today we're going to bring this study to a close. And the reason we have chosen to focus on the book of Ruth is because it touches on every relational dimension of love. What I mean is that you can read through the book of Ruth and you'll see the love of family members when you look at Naomi and Ruth, this mother-in-law and daughter-in-law who so love each other that they'll do anything for each other. You'll see the romantic love as we'll watch that come to fruition in our study today as you see a man named Boaz and a woman named Ruth fall in love with each other and be joined in marriage. You will see love for others depicted through Boaz's concern and care for those who are outcasts. If you walk through the story and pay attention to the characters in it, you'll see how they demonstrate love for God. And behind the scenes of the entire story, you discover God's love for His people. So we've been considering all these relationships, all these depictions of love, but we haven't been focused on, hey, let's talk about what it means to love our family today. Let's talk about what it means to love our wives or our husbands today. That's not been our focus. Our focus has been, what do we learn about love? How do we produce the fruit of love? And we're going to do that again today. We're going to investigate what we can learn simply about love in general as we look at the budding romance between Ruth and Boaz. The last two chapters of Ruth chapter 3 and Ruth chapter 4, tell us how they come together as a couple. And as we study that this morning, I want to point out 4 lessons we can learn about love from their relationship. And I want to start with this important lesson. And that is that love wants what's best. Now, I think we understand this. I think we know this. Because as parents in particular, you want what's best for your children. You want them to receive the best education. You want them to have the best opportunities for their career and for their growth and for their upbringing and for their future spouse and so on and so forth. You want what's best for them. When you have a loved one who's ill, when you have a loved one who's undergoing surgery, when you have a loved one who's dealing with treatments, you want them to receive the best medical care possible, and you'll drive great distances to achieve that. We understand this idea, at least, that love wants what's best in any given situation. Now, I want you to see how that is depicted in the story of Ruth. We actually need to start in chapter 2 to pick this up. See, in Ruth chapter 2, which we studied last Sunday, Ruth goes out and starts gleaning in the field of Boaz. What's happened is her and Naomi have returned from Moab, and now Ruth has the challenging task of providing for the two of them as an impoverished, widowed, childless woman in a society that is male-driven. So she does the one thing she can. She relies on the Israelite welfare system, which is centered around the agricultural practices of its people. And so she goes out to the field and she's picking up the pieces of grain that got missed. She's able to glean from the edges of the field that they're not allowed to reap. So she's going about this practice in Boaz's field, and Boaz, as we studied last week, shows tremendous kindness to her. At the end of the day, she comes home with a whole lot of grain, enough to sustain them for several days. And she tells her mother-in-law where she's been. And if you pay attention, you can see the wheels start churning in Naomi's mind. Because in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 20, after hearing that Ruth had gleaned in the field of Boaz, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." Now, it's nice that it just so happens Ruth is going to the field of a relative. But Naomi doesn't just mention their kinship. She mentions his status as a redeemer. That's where the wheels have started churning for Naomi. See, a kinsman redeemer, which is what she's referencing, is an individual who fulfills the levirate marriage policies of Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5 and 6. I'm not going to read the entirety of that passage on the screen, but according to Mosaic law, the law said that if you died and your wife was childless, then your sibling was to take her as his wife and was to produce an heir through her for you. This had everything to do with genealogy. This had everything to do with inheritance. This was a law instituted to ensure that an individual's name did not just disappear from their culture, from their society, from their family. And it ensured that the land of someone gets passed on to who it belongs to. And so, a kinsman redeemer is the family member who takes his relative's widow to be his wife for the primary purpose of producing a male offspring who would continue the lineage of her original husband. And that child born of this situation would not be the child of the one who's alive. He would be the child of the one who's dead, legally speaking. And so when Naomi makes mention that Boaz is a redeemer, in her mind, what she's really saying is, Boaz can give me a grandchild. That's what she's really thinking. Boaz can fulfill the Mosaic law that allows our lineage to continue. That's what's going through Naomi's mind. Now, she's not pushing any agenda here yet. She's simply acknowledging a possibility. But then it seems that she really wanted to see if this relationship would happen naturally. Before she gets involved, before she starts playing matchmaker, she wants to see if Boaz and Ruth will figure this out on their own. I think that's apparent when you look at verse 21 and 22 of Ruth chapter 2. Because Ruth reports to Naomi that Boaz gave her this instruction: You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. Boaz is being gracious. He's saying, hey, you're going to work you're going to glean right along my employees so you can get the best of the harvest, and you can do it until the harvest is done. And Naomi likes what she hears, but she gives a little nuance. She says to Ruth in verse 22, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women." Not his young men. She says his young women. "Lest in another field you be assaulted." Now, we mentioned last week how one of the policies that Boaz enacted while Ruth was in his field was that his men were not allowed to touch her. He had a policy that protected her. I don't think Naomi's really worried about that. I think she doesn't want Ruth to develop a relationship with one of those young men. I think she's suggesting that Ruth should stay with the young woman so that no courtship starts between her and one of these young men. In fact, in the next chapter, in Ruth chapter 3, we'll get to it in a moment, but in Ruth chapter 3, when Ruth goes to Boaz, he thanks her for not pursuing one of the young men. This is intentional. I really think Naomi is trying to help make things naturally occur between Boaz and Ruth, but they don't. We'll get to that in a moment. But I think what's significant is that Naomi wants this for Ruth. Now remember, this is a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Ruth's husband was Naomi's son. He passed away. But Naomi still wants Ruth to find love. She still wants Ruth to experience life as a wife and hopefully as a mother. She still wants what's best for Ruth. And so when we get to Ruth chapter 3 and we start in verse 1, and nothing naturally occurred between Boaz and Ruth, and the harvest is coming to an end, so they're not going to see each other every day anymore. That's when Naomi gets involved. And look at what she says. First thing she says, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" She's saying, should I not help you with finding what's best for you? Ruth, to this point, has chosen what's best for Naomi, and now Naomi's returning the favor and saying, I'm going to help you find what's best for you. And that, what was best for Ruth, was for her to be a wife and a mother again. From this example by Naomi, we're seeing the importance of love being concerned about what's best for others. Now, as I mentioned, we get this because we want what's best for people we love, but do we live by it daily? Do we even do it weekly or monthly? Do we go about our time with the constant reminder that the best thing I can do for the people I love is pursue what's best for them? That's a hard mentality to maintain constantly because we are naturally selfish at times. It just comes naturally to us, instinctually almost, to be selfish and to focus on what's best for me when I'm tired, when I'm not feeling well. Look at what Paul wrote to the church in Philippi in chapter 2 of Philippians. He gave these instructions. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. This is an expression of love because love wants what's best for others. And what Paul will do in this same chapter is he'll use Jesus as the ultimate example of such a loving mindset. And he'll talk about how Jesus emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, And he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Paul's point is that Jesus wanted what's best for all of mankind, even if a large percentage of mankind would never love him in return. Because love wants what's best. As we consider this in the context of Ruth and Naomi, do you really want what's best for the people you love? Or do you only want what's best for them when it's convenient for you? Maybe a more challenging question. Because Christ loved the world and he expects us to do the same. Do you want what's best for people that are never going to love you? Do you want what's best for people that may even categorically be your enemies? Do you want what's best for every soul you come in contact with in a given week? Because if you understand love, if you understand the love of Christ, it's going to change the way you look at people. It's going to change the way you interact with people. It's going to change the way you treat people. Because you're going to want what's best for them. Love wants what's best. But we also need to acknowledge that love heeds wise instruction. Have you ever refused to take advice from someone you love just because you wanted to prove that you didn't need their advice? Raise your hand if you've ever done that. Now, I should see every teenager and everyone who was a child at some point in their life raise their hand, because we all did it with our parents. At some point in time, our parents gave us advice and we just refused it. Not because it wasn't good advice, just because we're stubborn and we're idiots, for lack of a better word. We want to prove ourselves. And then there's a point in your adulthood when you actually start asking your parents for advice. Like you start going to people older than you, saying, well, how did you handle this? Or what would you do in this scenario? But there's this midway point where you don't want to hear anything from them. Some of you are right there right now. Here's the thing. Love listens to good, wise advice. Because love understands who it's coming from. One thing that I find really fascinating here in the book of Ruth is that Naomi is going to give some instructions to Ruth that seem a little odd to our 21st century ears. But let's look at it. Look at it in Ruth chapter 3, starting in verse 2 with me. Look at the instruction that Ruth is going to receive from Naomi. Naomi says, "Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." Now let me acknowledge one thing here. I like the way a fellow preacher said it. Sometimes the Bible describes what it does not prescribe. In other words, this isn't Holy Spirit inspired courtship. This is not God's way of saying that, hey, if you like a guy, you need to go sneak into his bedroom and lay at his feet of his bed until he wakes up. No, the Bible's not saying that. It's simply describing what Naomi told Ruth to do due to the cultural circumstances here. So, what is she telling Ruth to do? Number one, she's telling Ruth to let Boaz know she's not mourning anymore. Naomi instructs Ruth to do 3 things: to bathe, to put on some perfume, and to change her clothes. Now, we hear that and we're like, oh, she's trying to get all cleaned up to impress the man. No, she's ending her state of mourning the loss of her previous husband, and by her appearance, she's going to make it known to Boaz. Now, one way we know this is because David did this. If you go over to 2 Samuel chapter 12, particularly verse 20, you find out that David had spent a good portion of that chapter mourning the death of a child that he impregnated Bathsheba with. Now, that was the consequence of his adulterous affair, the death of that child. But after that child passed away, David had spent time fasting, praying, pleading with the Lord to spare the child's life. But after the child passed away, he ended that. He ended that state of mourning, the consequence, by bathing, by anointing himself, and by changing his clothes. So in that time and in that place, these 3 actions signal Ruth's return to the normal activities and desires of life, which would include marriage. So the change in her appearance is an indicator to Boaz that she's available and she's interested in him as her husband. The other reason Naomi gives these instructions is they are intended to show Boaz that she is requesting to be redeemed. So look at verses 8 through 11 here. At midnight, Boaz was startled and turned over, and behold, there's Ruth laying at his feet. He says, "Who are you?" She says, "I'm Ruth." And then she says, "Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." There's that redeemer terminology again. And notice in verse 9 and 10 in particular, Boaz knows exactly what she's talking about. "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men. And now, my daughter," verse 11, "do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask." What did she ask? She didn't point blank come out and say, "Hey, will you marry me?" No, he understood what she was asking, though. Now, a lot of scholars try to read a lot of sexual innuendo into this story. They try to make this about her making an advance on him in the night. That has nothing to do with it when you read context. You can go over and see how God used this same terminology, this same idea of spreading and covering in the book of Ezekiel. It's in Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 8. And he's talking about his relationship with Israel. And he said, "When I passed by you again and saw you, behold, you were at the age for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness." Now, you still might want to read some sexual innuendo into that, but that's not what it's saying. The terminology of spreading wings, of covering, is proposing a covenant relationship. What she's saying when she says, "Spread your wings over me," what she's saying is, will you redeem me? Will you make a covenant with me? In their context, the covenant of marriage. And will you take care of me? And will you protect me? And will you provide for me? That's what she's communicating to Boaz. That's what God was communicating to Israel in Ezekiel chapter 16. So when Naomi gave these instructions to Ruth, what she's saying is, go showing you're available, you're not mourning, and go request him to redeem you. And Ruth replied, "All that you say I will do." I'm fascinated by it. Ruth doesn't question it. Ruth doesn't go, "Now why am I doing this? Uncover his feet, but they're going to stink. He's been in the field all day." She doesn't question anything. She does exactly as her mother-in-law tells her to, because she understands the value of wise advice. I think it's significant to note that 3 times in Jesus' final discourse, which we're going to be studying tonight, the final discourse some more, so come back tonight, join us as we study that section of Scripture. But 3 times in the final discourse, Jesus is going to link love with keeping His commandments. Jesus associates loving Him with listening to and obeying what He tells you to do. Jesus understood the connection between love and heeding instruction. Do we? When it comes to our love for God, do we really love Him, or do we kind of take His instructions and find workarounds when we don't like them? Do we really love Him enough to do as He says without questioning, without complaining, without manipulating what He says? Does our love reflect this kind of expectation of heeding wise, godly instruction? Because love heeds wise instruction. Love also does what is right. I know I'm really stretching here to come up with something unique. Love does what is right. Now, I want you to think about this. Boaz wakes up in the middle of the night and there's a girl at the foot of his bed. First off, notice. He doesn't take advantage of her. They're alone. Nobody knows she's there. He doesn't see it as an opportunity for his own pleasure. Boaz doesn't send her away in the middle of the night, risking her safety. And Boaz makes sure she's up before the sun so that she can get out of there before anybody knows she was there and ruin her reputation. Now, I'm not advocating for the steps that Boaz takes. I still believe firmly in fleeing sexual immorality. But Boaz does what is right in this situation without taking advantage of it. Even more so, when you look at his response to her request for him to redeem her, look at how he answers her. He says, "It is true I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I." There's another relative who's closer to them in the family who has the right of first refusal. Now, here's the thing. This other relative, it's like he didn't even know Naomi was back. He hasn't appeared on the scene. He hasn't come to her aid. He hasn't helped or anything. So it would be very easy for Boaz to make this thing happen right now, marry Ruth and move on, and no one would be the wiser. But that's not how Boaz works. He's a man of integrity. And he's going to do what's right, even if it costs him what he wants. You see, her proposal is an offer he can't refuse, but it's also an offer he can't say yes to yet. And as someone who does what's right, he's going to see it through to the end. Let's not forget in the definition of love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 6, we're told that love does not rejoice at wrongdoing or at unrighteousness, as other translations say. Love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. What that's telling us is that love doesn't compromise its morals. Love doesn't compromise what's right just because it's convenient, just because it's what you want, just because nobody would know. Love does what's right. Love always does what's right. And Boaz demonstrates that here by not taking advantage of Ruth and by not taking advantage of this unknown relative who has the right to redeem first. And that brings us to chapter 4 of Ruth, where we learn one final lesson, and that is that love makes personal sacrifices. In Ruth chapter 4, Boaz met up with that other relative and tells him this in verse 3 and 4. He says, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. Boaz says, hey, you have first dibs. Do you want it? And upon hearing about the availability of Naomi's land, not Naomi, the availability of the land, this other unnamed relative immediately agrees to redeem it. Not her, it. What do you think this guy loves? It's not his family. It's not these impoverished ladies. It's that land. That's all he cares about. Now he knows that if he redeems it, if he purchases the land, he has to fulfill the levirate marriage. But here's what he's thinking. Naomi's past the age of childbearing. I'll buy the land. She won't be able to have a kid. That land then becomes part of my inheritance, part of my estate, makes me more wealthy. I like this deal. But if he had cared anything about Naomi and been in the picture at all since her return, then he would know that there is a fine print. And that fine print is that Naomi didn't come back alone. She came back with Ruth. The inheritance of Elimelech had already been passed on to Ruth's son, Mahlon, who was married to Naomi's son, Mahlon, who was married to Ruth. And now the one who is supposed to be providing a descendant to inherit that land is not Naomi, it's Ruth. And Ruth is still in her prime for bearing children. So Boaz tells him, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. And upon hearing that, this unnamed relative automatically backs out of the deal. It's like, I can't do it. He actually says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Now, how is he going to do that? Here's how it works. You use your money to buy the land. You then have a child with the widow. That land then automatically becomes that child's land because it's his inheritance, because you're producing an heir for the deceased first husband of the widow. So essentially what happens is you're paying out of pocket for land that's never going to be passed on to your own children. Any financial advisor would tell you that's a loss. And it's a sacrifice, a financial sacrifice that this unnamed relative is unwilling to make. But it's the very same sacrifice that Boaz is more than willing to make. Boaz is going to buy that land with his own money. That land's never going to be a part of his estate. But Boaz doesn't care because he doesn't love the land. He loves Ruth. See, when you love someone, you will make personal sacrifices. You will give things up because of that love. You remember what Jesus said in John chapter 15, verse 12 and 13? This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. And what would Jesus do less than 24 hours after that statement? Lay down his life. Do you love enough to sacrifice? Do you love enough to give something up? This guy did. His name is Maximilian Kolbe. He was a Polish Catholic priest during World War II. You know, I don't know if you've figured this out yet, but I love history. I especially love history that you don't hear about very often. Maximilian was arrested by the Nazis in May of 1941, sent to Auschwitz. A couple of months later, a prisoner managed to escape Auschwitz. And the commandant of that concentration camp decided, as punishment and as a deterrent for those present in the camp, he was going to take 10 men and starve them to death. They announced the 10 men that were chosen. One of them, whose name I can't even pronounce, upon hearing his name chosen, began to cry out, "My wife, my children!" Maximilian was present, and when he heard that that man had a wife and children, he volunteered to take his place. He and 9 other men were taken to an underground bunker where for 2 weeks they received no food or water. Most of them died in that time, but not Maximilian. After 2 weeks, the soldiers came down and were tired of him and 3 other men still being alive, so they gave him a lethal injection of carbolic acid. And he died on August 14th, 1941, about 3 months after he arrived at Auschwitz. He made the decision to sacrifice himself for another. Probably not a decision you and I are going to have to make. We may. But are we willing to make such sacrifices? Maybe they don't have to be that grand. Some of the sacrifices we make, we'll sacrifice our time. We'll sacrifice our time to be with a brother or a sister who's recovering from surgery in the hospital, or who's enduring treatment for cancer. Some of us will sacrifice our finances in our homes to provide a safe place for a child to grow who was up for adoption or who was in foster care. Some of us will sacrifice our comfort to go serve those in need or share the gospel with those who haven't heard it in places like Honduras or India or Nepal or Camp Inagahie. Some of us will sacrifice access to our favorite hockey franchise every home game to go where the Lord wants us to serve. We know what sacrifice is. It's really just a matter of whether or not we're willing to love that much. As we conclude our study of love from the book of Ruth, May we all seek to love the way God loved us, because He's the standard and the originator. And may it be reflected in our lives, not just with those closest to us, but with everyone we come in contact with, because that's the way the world will know that we're His. If you haven't been loving the way you should, then you're invited to make that correct right now. We love each and every one of you, and so we offer the invitation that the Lord offers for you to come make things right. And if you need to do that, we invite you to come. Let us love on you while together we stand and sing.